Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of All Things M365 Compliance. I am, of course, Ryan John Murphy. I am a compliance SME here at Microsoft and a former MVP. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Nikki. Hey, Nikki, how's things?
Hi everyone, my name is Nikki Chappell. I'm a Principal Cloud Architect at Cloudway and I'm a Microsoft MVP in Microsoft 365 and security. And welcome everyone to our session today. We're really pleased to be able to invite Susan Lamb to our podcast as a guest today. So welcome.
Well, no, thank you for having me. Really great to come and join your podcast. So I'm Susan. I'm from Protection. I'm their Principal Data Governance SME, and I'm a lawyer by trade, so might as well just get that out in the open now. And for over 20 years, I was the SME at Shell, responsible for basically the retention and disposal of information, and actually the product owner for information lifecycle management across the group. So I'm here to talk about my experience and how what I can bring to the table in terms of data governance, really.
Thanks for joining us, Susan. Really appreciate it. So I think you're becoming a bit famous in this space, I think, Susan, from a data governance, data lifecycle management perspective. I know we've crossed paths a number of times from a Microsoft perspective, and Nikki and I also have crossed paths from an events and showcasing perspective also. So it's good to have you here. From a data lifecycle management perspective, data governance perspective, a lot of people seem to go into analysis paralysis with these types of things, Susan. So it'd be good to understand your time at Shell, given the integration that you had from Shell from an M365 adoption perspective. What were your initial thoughts around the solution stack from M365? And what were your initial priorities with that data within M365 from a DLM DG perspective?
Thanks for saying I've got a bit of reputation. I do go on a lot about data governance and its importance. In terms of my experience at Shell, it was obviously quite a long process. And the technology or then the functionality in Microsoft 365 for managing data lifecycle evolved all the while I was in the role, and it was actually very limited. If we go back, 10 or 12 years ago, it was very basic records management. But we kind of always knew that the best thing to do with data governance was to make it really practical and workable in amongst both records and information. And having information and records in one place and be able to manage those in a compliant manner was something that we thought as a business would be the perfect way forward. And then you fast forward to sort of now with M365, and it certainly has ticked those boxes in terms of being able to manage your information from a compliant perspective. So you have obviously being able to retain valuable information using record labels, retention labels, and retention policies, and then being able to do what, again, I go on about a lot. Once you've protected your valuable information, is then to do some deletions and get rid of that redundant, obsolete, and trivial information. So I think it has got to a point now where if, as a business, you want to be able to do that, keep your valuable information and delete what you don't need, then M365 has got a really rich range of tools and functionalities. And in some cases, actually can be an overwhelming choice as this is retention policies, record labels. So, that's good, but I just want to make sure there are some limitations as well, of course. It's not a perfect world. If you're a pure records manager, and you live in the old, content manager days where you had pure, really granular metadata, really granular retention management, you may not get that sort of thing in M365, but from a practical business perspective, managing a business and running a business, I think there's lots of opportunities to do it in a really sensible way in M365, to be honest.
I think from my experience, a lot of people just seem to gravitate towards retention policies because the workload. And then they'll kind of just forget about retention labels, records versioning labels, and so on and so forth. And I guess more often than not, Susan, that would probably meet most of the requirements. But when you've got those unique requirements at a file level rather than a workload level, I often have conversations and say to customers, well, you do have retention labels. Oh, well, we can't have them, right? They're an E5. Well, actually not. They're actually an E3. Retention labels are E3. If you're trying to use the automated piece of it, that's where the E5 comes in. And then the light bulb goes off and is like, oh, we can actually do a bit more content retention here rather than just firing off a load of workloads from a retention policy perspective. I know you've worked on quite a number of DLM pieces and data governance pieces over the last few months, right, Nikki, with some of your customers as well. And that's been a bit of a theme as well from memory, right?
Yeah, I think in what's really triggering the change now is Copilot. Copilot can see everything you have access to. And there's so many of the customers that I work with, Microsoft said, move everything into the cloud. It's safer in the cloud. So, I think the best will in the world, people tried to do migration projects and delete all of that, redundant, obsolete, trivial data. But often with time pressures, they couldn't find owners. Who owns that data? I don't know. Well, let's migrate it in instead. So we've got a lot of customers, I find, where they've migrated all of this historical data in. Plus, they haven't had any retention policies. So they've now filled up their SharePoint, bought more storage, and then suddenly said, well, why am I getting this out of date information coming back in Copilot? So I think it's bringing it more top of mind, I think, which is, I think, really good news. People are finally taking kind of data seriously.
Don't want to sound like a broken record, but AI is rubbish in, rubbish out. And I think the challenge is that people they kind of do know that, but then sort of kind of it goes to the back of their mind because they're so keen to get the co-pilot rolling it out and working. And great. And as they should, because it's going to be such a valuable tool. But actually, the underlying quality of the data, which often isn't great, like you say, because of old migration projects, or perhaps, they've never had any life cycle management before, now starting to show its ugly head. And I think I think personally, fast forward a couple of months or even a year, that's when people will really be thinking, oh gosh, we really need to get our data in order because this Copilot output is not really as high quality as we thought. And I say to people, well, do that if you can earlier, do that as soon as you can possibly do, because you're just storing up problems in the future otherwise.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think we've said it many times on this podcast, Nikki, the fact that, and I even heard it yesterday, first day back yesterday after my holidays, and the customer I had was like, you've given me Copilot, but he's created all this risk. So, well, let me just stop you there. The risk has always been there. That data has always been there. You've just enabled a solution to surface that data and reason over that data and give it back to the user. It's always been there. The pupils dilate as if they're thinking to themselves, oh, actually, this is a data governance problem that we could have solved a long time ago. It's like, well, we do have solutions to help you along with that now. But when I asked them, do you have retention policies in place? Yeah, of course we do. Okay, what are they? They're a retain forever. Where are you going with this then? You're expecting a Copilot and any other solution, or even your data governance reviewers. We'll talk about disposition reviews later on. To understand the data that they've got, and you've got so much data, cold, hot, warm data, just massive sprawl because of Teams sprawl, SharePoint sprawl, OneDrive sprawl, unmanaged mailboxes, a keep forever and all your workload retention policies. What are you expecting?
I think it's sometimes that people just don't join the dots because there's all this kind of pressure to use AI, which is actually, in many ways very, very good. And it's, what we need to do as a society is really benefit a trustworthy AI and use it. But actually underneath that is the quality. And I think, again, something I refer to a lot, people generally are data hoarders. It's a comfort blanket. People like to have the information so they can look at it. And when I was implementing the data lifecycle management at Shell, and in that process, we rolled out record labels across M365 and implemented what we called a non-record, i.e., everything that isn't valuable information, deletion policy of anything not modified after 3 years or labeled as a record. was automatically deleted. And I had a lot of people coming up to me sort of saying, well, I need to keep this information. It's valuable. And I would say, well, that's fine. You can keep it. If it is a record, it's valuable. Label it as a record. We're not stopping you from keeping information that's valuable. What we're doing is clearing away the rubbish, the things that is out of date, that is trivial, and that you don't really, it's creating compliance risk, cyber risk, of course, because the more information you've got that you probably don't need to keep, the more risky it is in terms of hacking and breaches. Again, I used to say to people, if you are hacked or you have a ransomware attack, and there's been a few of those in the UK recently, it's not good on any level. And if your information gets out, but it's even worse if that information you shouldn't have kept in the first place, personal data. Look at the companies that have been breached and have had this hassle now. What the billions of pounds they've lost in profits and income and reputation. So I think people generally do like to keep things. You can give them the ability in the tooling to be able to keep things, which that's what you get in 365 with the retained policies or the record policies. And the automation now, of course. I mean, we didn't have the benefit of all the rich automation that you can use now to auto label, but definitely help customers now to implement that. Then you can confidently delete the rest.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Great strategy, great forward thinking, always goes amiss. Because one of the things I hear a lot, and I'm sure Nikki will roll her eyes now because she's heard it that much, and probably the same, is I don't want to interrupt my users. I don't want to, give my users something that they don't want to do. It's like, well, they are your users and it is their data. So it is it's your responsibility to ensure that data is either kept correctly from a retention, regulatory perspective, or even like from a Copilot perspective now. Even just reading yesterday some of the posts on LinkedIn from some of the people that I follow, like Rafa Knight, who's been on the podcast before, where regulators are now are kind of up in arms of, do we need to retain this data adequately enough for whatever purpose? And that leaves you in the background as a data governance consultant thinking, well, just give me a number to keep it from, give me a set number of years to keep it from. But I see a bit of a trend at the moment where people are saying, I'm going to keep it for 7 years because of my GDPR, because people are now asking for that workload. They're not just asking for Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive anymore. They're asking for Copilot, where I've mentioned Copilot, or where any documentation has been mentioned in Copilot. So there's a bit of a theme, whether it's right or wrong, of people keeping Copilot chats now for 7 years. And that's a great start, because I think if data is not retained, it's not discoverable, so you can pull all those prompts back, so on and so forth. But that in itself gives people the mindset of, well, I can actually pick a date out here and start deleting stuff. I don't have to have a keep forever on. It causes a lot of problem. I mean, you only need to look in the news, and anybody can potentially Google this. I'm not going to give the company's name away, where a couple of years ago, they was investigated by the regulator on the Ofcom here in the UK and also in the US. Now, the US legislation is give me everything that you've got. And because they haven't deleted data accordingly, they actually classified themselves into a legal case, which cost them $3.5 million. Now, if they'd have removed that data adequately in North under M365, then there'd have been $3.5 million up at this point in time.
Yeah. Well, there's so many points there, though. I think I'm going to have to come back on this podcast because I'll be here all day. I mean, just two things from what you said. Don't interrupt the users is a really key thing. I mean, and actually that is right. I mean, people, most companies aren't information management companies. They're not there to manage information. They're there to provide energy or to sell retail clothes or whatever. They're not there to do information management. But equally, you do have to give the users an accountability because the information is a valuable business asset. But now with the tooling in M365, and that's the whole point of the auto deletion policies, you've got the auto classification to identify the records and retain them. And then you've got auto deletion there. So that is actually taking the onus off the user to have to do the deletion. Because we all know you have to delete personal data when you no longer need it. And then the litigation point. I mean, I can't not pick that up because I'm a lawyer. People, I'll go back to your information hoarder who will say, I need to be able to go back to all 30 years of my stuff. And I did that once because we had a case and I saved the day. And that's a hero. They saved the day because they were able to find maybe an email or a document that were really relevant to the case, and they were heroes and, great. But if you talk to, like you mentioned, the US lawyers, if you talk to them about how their society, how their case, their litigation works, as you say, you have to disclose everything that's good, everything that relates to the case, and that can be good, either good or bad. You can't filter, just give them the good stuff. You have to give them everything. And often, because you've kept everything, for the one information hero, there'll be 10 other cases where it's a smoking gun. A bit like you mentioned, a smoking gun that actually is like, okay, there's an email here which is basically going to completely shut our case out in the open. We better start settlement conversations.
I think we're all saying there's enough tools now in M365 to give you the opportunity to retain data adequately enough, but also to delete data adequately enough, and even preserve and put data on legal hold. You can use e-discovery to do that. And again, that's something that we talk about a lot, isn't it, Nikki? Using the right retention versus preservation when it comes to the data in the background. Is that something you've come across yourselves, Nikki, Susan?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a really pertinent point that I like, as a lawyer to be able to kind of take apart, because there is absolutely the need to preserve information that's potentially relevant to a criminal in a regulatory investigation or a litigation. You absolutely have to do that. And as you rightly say, the e-discovery functionality, preservation hold functionality that is in Purview can very much help with that. But it's very different from retaining information that you need from a business value perspective or compliance. Because people again used to say to me, well, you can't delete this, Susan, because I need it in case of litigation in the future. Well, if it's potentially relevant, absolutely put it on preservation hold, but it can still be a record with its record retention period that is, and the two things overlay each other. So a preservation hold on top of a record label would prevent the record being disposed when it came to the end of its retention period because it's on hold. But you wouldn't just put something on preservation hold just to keep it because it's a record. So they're very different things, but they work very closely together for the overall aim, which is about consistent, defensible disposition and retention of information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the amount of times I've gone to customers, had the conversation around retention versus preservation versus hold, and they've just put everything on e-discovery hold, every element. And it's like, well, why have you done that? So we don't want people to delete anything. Well, you're using the wrong solution. All right, I get the right purpose that you're trying to achieve. I get the right mindset there, but you're using completely the wrong solution. And then they'll have like this mass e-discovery case kickoff, like an org-wide e-discovery case kickoff. And they'll have to put additional components on hold. And it's like, well, I've run out of all my e-discovery hold because there's a limitation on them. Yeah, because you're using e-discovery hold for everything in your environment and there's a limitation on it. If you need to keep things forever, for whatever purpose, as long as there's a purpose that maps to a regulatory alignment or an internal compliance need, use a retention policy or a retention label to do that and just apply that to that workload, that library, that user, that mailbox. You've got to be really smart about this stuff because e-discovery is an investigation tool. It's not a preservation tool. Well, I'm just going to enable pres hold on everything on all the SharePoint sites, and then they wonder why they've got no storage left, or they're running out of storage rapidly in the background, and Microsoft are asking for more money for more storage. Retention policies, retention labels gives you both of those, the aforementioned and the latter mentioned, in the right aspect of saying, I need to retain it because, and I need to retain it based on created or modified, but I also need to retain it for X amount of time. E-discovery hold, as you've just said, Susan, and preservation hold will always win if it's applied to the consequence. Yeah, even if that retention period expires, an e-discovery hold is on or preservation hold within the library is on, it always wins. The data is always going to stay there until that case is removed or preservation hold library is removed from that aspect. So we've got the right tools, but sometimes often are misinformed
Yeah, definitely. I have seen that with customers, and that's kind of what we kind of help them with at the end of the day, is really sort of taking that apart. Because, I mean, you know much more than me, and I absolutely not going to talk technical, but there are very different technical differences between what happens to information when it's on hold compared to when it goes into a record or retention policy. I know what happens is that when something's on the preservation hold, it goes into a separate container, which is a preservation library. As I understand it, that preservation library is not particularly well structured. It is literally there for lawyers to do e-discovery. It's not there for information governance type purposes. So it's really good that people do really understand the differences between that. And it sort of goes back to what I said before. You know, the functionality in M365 is very rich, and in many ways overwhelmingly rich at times. But there are some really key sort of basic principles between those sorts of things, like the difference between a preservation hold, what a record label is, what a retention policy is, and what a deletion policy is, that you can then, if you get those fundamentals, you can just start simple. You don't have to implement the whole suite all at once, and you can build as you go. And that's why we advocate having an information management strategy, a sort of a view of how you want your information across the whole environment, how you want the policies to work, to do what you achieve, both from a compliance perspective, but also in the access to business information. If you're going to apply preservation holds to everything, that solved my preservation problem, but it's like a sledgehammer to crack a nut, to put it mildly. We keep all our business information, so that's also tick that box. That access to that information by real business people to be able to use it is all in the preservation library, which really only lawyers have access to, and you can't find anything in there anyway with the normal means. So it's not achieving the result that they think it is. So that's why it's so important to have podcasts and webinars to help people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think as well, just while you were talking there as well, Susan, because I do a lot with e-discovery, the amount of times where I've been brought in to help people because what they've searched for is so broad and the data is so vast because they've never deleted anything or they've preserved everything or whatever the case may be. When they get that data into that review set, I mean, it can be 6, 7, 8 times the value of data of what they thought they were getting. And it's like, well, now you're in a situation where you're having to pay for outside counsel to spend weeks to go through this data, where if you had the right retention policies in place, you had a decent SharePoint Online design, you used preservation hold where you needed to, and you also used e-discovery hold where you needed to, your data that was inside that review set would probably 7 to 10% of what you've actually brought back. That makes so much easier for you, and it makes it so much cheaper for you to go outside counsel and go through that data. So even, I'm quite famous for saying data is not retained, it's not discoverable. It has to be in the right principle to bring that data back.
What I've come across is when I'm working with international organizations, obviously they've got different regulatory requirements for the different countries, as well as kind of business areas as well. How much work do you try to do to kind of streamline those it can be hundreds of different policies, and it's either from, when it was created or when they kind of action happened, from last access from a particular event. Do you try and work with the organizations to actually try and streamline that to make that more manageable for actually creating the records? Or do you take the approach where there should be a separate record label for every different thing on the file plan?
Yeah, great question again. And absolutely, simplicity is key here. And it's exactly what we had at Shell, actually. We had about 5,000 different retention categories. I mean, Shell present in 80 countries, all diverse range of functions and business activities. So the amount of complex matrix of legislation to navigate was huge, and the number of laws and they're subject to retention wise is massive. When they they had a retention schedule that evolved over many years and got bigger and bigger, it was 5,000. And actually, I mean, I'm sure Purview could cope with 5,000 record labels, but can users, if you have to when you have to update that, I mean, there's so many problems with having, that many. So one of the first things we did actually was simplify that retention schedule. And we went down to about 120 what we called group record types, which were the main ones. And then obviously there were some countries like Norway, for example, that has a lot of longer retention periods. And in fact, in country, a lot of hydrocarbon legislation, they have to keep things forever, as they do in many countries actually. So for Norway, we had like a lot of retention labels that were, or one actually, that was just 99 permanent forever. So we went from about 5,000 to about 180 record labels in Purview that we then used adaptive scopes to, don't tell me, let me tell you how, but to be able to then in a SharePoint site or to a mailbox, a shared mailbox, just create and we would ideally have a maximum of 10 record labels for each SharePoint site that would then be classified, information could be classified to. Now, I say 10 because 10 we think is a good, there's the sort of like when you're scrolling down a list as a user to be able to pick. If you're doing auto classification, it makes it simpler the less you've got in the SharePoint site. But also, it's a lot mobile working and people can scroll through 10. And people say, well, maybe there was more than information types in a SharePoint collection. And then at that point, we would encourage SharePoint collections to be, kind of more focused. We went to some areas of the business that had massive SharePoint collections, and they're not good to manage from an information governance perspective on any level, let alone data lifecycle management. So yeah, in answer to your question, it is possible for a company, a global company, to have what we call a big bucket retention schedule, which basically has, as I say, in Shell's case, it was about 180 record types. And that's something that I work on a lot with customers. I've got a call after this actually I'm doing exactly that for someone. So I would suggest that's one of the first places to start if you're going to implement retention labels in Purview.
I think that's really useful to try and keep it simple, because as you say, it just becomes overwhelming. And I'm a personal fan of the adaptive scopes. I think that's really good as part of the kind of the wider governance in Microsoft 365 when you come outside of Purview. When somebody goes and creates a team or creates a SharePoint site, there should always be a structured provisioning process whereby you capture that metadata. Is this site going to be for HR purposes?
Yeah.
Is it for facilities?
Yeah.
Is it for finance? Is it for project management? Whatever it is. And then based on that, capturing that metadata, you can write that to the SharePoint site, and then you use that to target then your adaptive scopes. This is an HR site. We only need to show the HR relevant record labels to that site.
Yeah, and then sorry, let me just say one other thing, because it's quite good as a part of your overall information strategy, and it goes back to that keeping things as simple as possible for users. There's often in organizations data or record that isn't actually in Purview or 365. For example, a lot of HR, you mentioned HR, is managed in systems like Workday. And if you've got your record system, your system of record is Workday for your personnel files, you actually don't then need to have a record type for personnel files in Purview. And that's part of the work we do so you don't need that in your record labels in what they call label policies. So again, it keeps that information smart because it's only got the information in it that you need, and you don't create a whole set of record label policies for information that actually is quite adequately managed outside of Purview.
Yeah, and I think going back to my earlier comment, I think that's where that analysis paralysis comes in. Where that data is linked into other applications, but it still seems as a stream of data into M365, where they're thinking, well, there is some integration into M365, so I need to find a way to bring it into M365 to retain it when they could just retain it in place wherever it may be, And again, I think that is a very simplistic design principle to take away from this podcast today as don't make it overly complex. Just concentrate on what you need to retain based on the timeline that you need to do, and then use the tools within there. The last tool we'll talk about, and this is a tool I think is either going to be your best friend or your worst enemy for your defensible disposal program, is disposition reviews. Because some sometimes I've seen them rolled out. I've had customers come to me and say, when we're just not able to delete data, we're given an opportunity to delete data by a disposition review. And it's like, okay, so how have you set up that disposition review? Well, the first disposition review is the user who owns the data. So the first thing they're going to do is turn around to you and say, no, I want to keep everything forever. So your second, third, fourth, fifth, if you've got them in there at that point in time are irrelevant, and it's like,
Yeah.
well, do you want the user to understand the data that they're working with, or do you just want to be able to delete that data because it's not, labeled accordingly? And that then splits a lot of minds to say, oh, well, the user really needs to be authenticated to delete the data. And some others are like, well, maybe not. Maybe we should just delete it because we know it's not labeled.
Yeah, well, I mean, disposition reviews, yeah, probably could do a whole podcast on those. But I mean, I think first of all, two things, just really quickly, because I know we're coming to time. First thing is, I would say, look at your retention schedule, a bit back to Nikki's question, and make as many of your retention periods definite. And I'm not going to say who they were because I'm under NDA, but a huge company, I saw their retention, not one was definite. It was all then subject to review. And you can absolutely have definite. The second thing is a lot of people say, well, lawyers have to review it. We have to get legal's approval. If you're in M365 and it's under preservation hold, it won't even come up for disposition review. So that's solved there. And the third thing is there will be some where you do have to have a disposition review. And then I think, again, like you're alluding to, really keep the process as streamlined as possible. From making sure that it's the right people, and that's where good information governance comes, having good information ownership. So going back to Shell, I mean, we did remove many of our disposition review. I think we, out of the 150, 180 record types, I think we ended up with about 10 or so
Yeah. Okay.
subject to disposition review. And those were the ones that were only those where we had maybe personal data that we needed to make sure that we had to link it to an event. But otherwise, we really made some quite pragmatic risk-based decisions, because at the end of the day, I take the view if you've got a disposition review that isn't working, then you're basically keeping it indefinitely.
Yep. Yep. That's the ultimate out of that, right? And I think that's an amazing point to stop. This has been really informative, Susan, and we definitely will get you back on.
Yeah.
Expand on the discussions today. Any closing comments from yourself, Nikki?
I think it's really important looking at this area. This is not owned by IT. And I think this is where a lot of companies get it wrong. They think it's an IT decision. It's not. This is a strategic business decision where you need the different stakeholders, you need the legal, the compliance, the DPOs, etc. in there, and you need the leaders within the different business areas.
Yeah, business really have to have exactly.
Well, thanks again, Susan, for joining us. It's, as always, been a fantastic episode. We really do want to see you back, so we'll be back in touch for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're right on time there.
See you later. Bye.
Join us again. See you next time. Bye.